My sister accidentally sent me a voice memo meant for our mom, and what I heard about me made me leave the next morning with a plan she never saw coming. Before I tell you how I turned that betrayal into one of the most satisfying revenge stories of my life, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next jaw-dropping story. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. It started with a mistake. A tiny slip of her finger. My phone buzzed one evening, and I saw a new notification. A voice memo from my sister, Emily. We weren't the closest siblings, but we were family. I thought maybe she was sending me a funny update, or perhaps a reminder for our mom's birthday dinner. I hit play. Her voice spilled through the speaker, low and mocking. "She's such a burden, Mom. Always acting like she's better than us because she has her own place. Honestly, I don't know why you keep defending her. She's selfish, ungrateful, and completely useless. If I were you, I'd stop talking to her altogether." My stomach turned cold. It was supposed to go to Mom. She had meant for me to hear it, but I did. Every single venomous word. I replayed it twice, thinking maybe I had misheard. Maybe there was some context I was missing. But no, it was clear. My sister, my own blood, saw me not as family, but as a burden. Someone disposable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Emily's words running like poison through my mind. Memories of every time I had defended her, every dollar I'd lent, every late-night call I'd answered when she needed me. All of it felt twisted now, cheapened by her betrayal. By dawn, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay. Not here, not like this. She thought I was weak, a burden, useless. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. I packed my bags in silence. As the sun rose, spilling gold across the sky, I slipped out of the house with a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't enough to walk away. No. Emily needed to learn that when you betray trust this deeply, the consequences will cut sharper than any words ever could. And I was going to be the one to teach her. I'd always prided myself on being the steady one, the person who stayed calm while everyone else panicked. Empathy had been my default setting. Patience was my reflex. But the voice memo did something to me that no kindness ever had. It broke me in a way that felt permanent and, paradoxically, clarifying. The betrayal cut away the fog and left a bright, cold outline of what I deserved and what I would no longer tolerate. I left that morning with a single backpack and a notebook. I didn't want drama, so I didn't slam doors. I locked mine, slid the key under a potted fern by the porch. Old habits die slow, and walked to the nearest subway. The city felt indifferent, a river of people flowing around my private eruption. On the train, I wrote the word boundary at the top of the notebook and underlined it twice. First, I had to breathe. I rented a small room above a bakery in a part of town that smelled faintly of yeast and wet asphalt. The landlord was a bearded man who asked no questions. I slept in the first bed I'd had in months with a sense of being both fugitive and liberated. The bakery lady brought me coffee and a pastry and told me, without irony, that grief rearranges your life for you whether you want it or not. I liked the sentence so much I wrote it down. Second, I needed counsel. I called a lawyer, not to plot revenge, but to understand my rights. The lawyer listened, fingers steepled. She told me what I already felt but hadn't framed in legal language. Document everything. Keep copies. Don't text when you're angry. She explained about defamation risk, about how a hurt person's attempt to shame someone online can blow back if it crosses lines. She warned me about the viral trap, how airing private family grievances publicly can make everyone poorer in reputation, not just the offender. I wanted justice, not chaos. So I built a plan that would stay in the safe lane, methodical, lawful, and designed to protect myself while making consequences unavoidable for Emily if she continued to treat me as disposable. The notebook became my command center. I listed facts, the voice memo date and time, the exact words, who else had been present when she had whispered similar things in other gatherings, the loans I'd given her over the years with dates, the birthday presents I'd brought and unloaded. I called Mom and asked, quietly, about the message. She stammered, first denying any memory of Emily's call, then muttering defenses she could not sustain. In the end, she admitted the memo had been about me and that Emily had said even worse things in the car on the way to Grandma's funeral. Mom's voice softened. "I didn't want to make waves," she said. "I thought telling you would make things worse." That was protection masquerading as cowardice. Third, I collected proof. The memo itself was the seed. I backed it up to a password-protected cloud. I recorded legally, in my own space, short notes after every relevant interaction. Dates, times, direct quotes. I took screenshots of text threads where Emily made offhand comments that echoed the memo. I scanned bank statements to document the last time I'd lent her money. I did not hunt for dirt. I cataloged what already existed, because the pattern mattered more than any single comment. Fourth, I set up boundaries. I changed shared account passwords, moved shared files out of joint cloud folders, and began transferring anything valuable I had stored in family-accessible places into my new personal accounts. This was less poetic and more practical. I was removing the opportunity for petty sabotage and preparing for a life that was no longer run through their permission. But evidence and logistics are only half of what makes a plan effective. The other half is timing and psychology. I watched Emily for weeks with the patience of a gardener waiting for a tree to bear fruit. She didn't change her behavior in public. She still smiled at family gatherings, posted vacation photos with the captions "so grateful for family," and tagged my mother in sentimental quotes. Privately, she called Mom to strategize about who to bring to the summer get-together, as if she hadn't already been convicted by her own voice. Knowing the terrain, I picked my moment carefully. There was a family birthday coming up, Mom's 60th, a dinner that always drew the entire clan, and an assortment of friends who idolized the matriarch. They would all be there. Uncles who liked to play judge at dessert, cousins who liked to side with whoever made the loudest case. It was perfect. People came to celebrate. They came with good cheer and a comfortable suspension of suspicion. If you wanted to shift a narrative in such a space, you had to be surgical. I wasn't going to ambush Emily in a humiliating viral way. The lawyer's voice echoed in my head. Consider your long-term interests. I wanted a remedy that changed how people treated me and rescued my reputation without blowing up into a tabloid frenzy. So I designed a public truth that was precise. Not a shout of accusation, but a quiet unspooling of a pattern. In the weeks building to the dinner, I did 3 things that looked ordinary but were lethal in their cumulative force. 1. I rebuilt my narrative. I began to reach out to friends and distant relatives, not in anger, but by sharing stories of who I was, the community work I'd been doing, the little kindnesses no one thought to attribute to me. People had a way of forgetting the labor behind a life. My small campaign was to remind the network gently, through stories and photos, who I had always been. The goal was simple: preempt the "she's dramatic" defense Emily would rely on. 2. I secured a neutral witness for the dinner. Not vindictive, not a spy, but someone with quiet authority. Aunt Rosa, a teacher who had taught several cousins and was universally respected for fairness. I called her months before and asked if she would attend Mom's dinner. She did so gladly. I didn't tell her everything, only that I'd appreciate her moral compass at the table and that I valued her presence. 3. I prepared the reveal. I printed the memo transcript and copies of related texts and receipts, arranged them in a neat folder, and made an extra set for the lawyer. I wrote a short statement, calm, factual, not designed to inflame, but to document. Then, I layered my last, subtle move into the plan. I asked the restaurant to seat us near the small private alcove where the staff could discreetly bring the folder to the table if needed. I wasn't trying to orchestrate drama. I was creating an efficient channel for truth if truth needed to be told. In the days leading up to the dinner, I felt both terror and a curious lightness. Terror because the act of exposing a family fault feels like stepping into a storm that might damage whatever remains. Lightness because finally, at the end of my throat, there was a sentence I could speak that wasn't a plea. I will not be treated as a burden. For the first time in years, that sentence felt like armor. On the night of Mom's 60th, under warm lights and the hush of a room full of people remembering a life, I would be ready. I would not yell. I would not smear. I would only show what had been said, then let the facts sit between plates and speeches like an uninvited truth. Emily never expected the quietness of my approach. She had trained herself to read fury as the only language of consequence. She had not learned that a composed, lawful response can be more devastating than a screaming match. At dawn, I slept poorly, but I slept with purpose. My plan was not a mere retaliation. It was a re-education of a small, dangerous system that had taken me for granted. The next day would be the moment I learned whether boundaries could be taught and whether the family would side with the person who tended the cabin of their history or with the one who used that cabin's piece as a plaything. The restaurant glowed with soft amber light, the kind meant to soften wrinkles and disguise tension. Long tables were pushed together, covered in linen and candles. Glasses chimed, laughter spilled, and for a while I let myself be swept into the rhythm of celebration. Mom sat at the head of the table, wearing a crown of paper flowers my little cousin had made. She beamed, and for her sake I wore my best mask, calm, polite, attentive. Only the folder under my chair reminded me why I was here. Emily arrived late, as usual, in a dress too bright for the occasion, phone already in her hand. She hugged Mom, air-kissed aunts, then slid into the seat across from me without a glance. It was her confidence, her casual dismissal, that almost made me laugh. She had no idea. The evening flowed. Toasts were made, cake was cut. The cousins clinked glasses, and uncles argued about sports. Finally, as plates of dessert were cleared, Emily leaned toward Mom and said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "You know, Mom, I still don't understand why you let her." She flicked her eyes toward me. "Talk to you like she's the responsible one. We both know who really carries the weight in this family." There it was, the memo, reborn in public. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached under the chair, lifted the folder, and placed it on the table. The sound of paper sliding across linen was louder than any accusation. "What's that?" Emily scoffed, though her eyes betrayed the first flicker of unease. "Your words," I said quietly. "The ones you sent me by accident. The ones you repeated tonight. I thought it was only fair everyone else heard them too." I opened the folder. The transcript lay on top, bold and sharp. "She's selfish, ungrateful, completely useless." Gasps rippled down the table. Aunt Rosa leaned forward, reading silently, lips pressed into a thin line. Emily's face drained of color. "That's out of context." "Then here's the context," I interrupted, tapping the second page. A screenshot of her text to Mom, echoing the same insults. And here, receipts of money I'd lent her, the unpaid debts she had conveniently forgotten while calling me a burden. The room grew hushed, the only sound the clink of a spoon nervously set down. Mom's face was pale. "Emily, is this true?" Emily stammered, her voice cracking. "It was a joke, just a private vent. You know how siblings are." But no one laughed. Not one person. For years she had spun herself as the golden child, the responsible one, the backbone. Tonight, the mask slipped, and underneath was nothing but contempt and entitlement. Aunt Rosa spoke first. Her voice was steady, like a gavel. "A joke doesn't repeat itself in texts and calls. A joke isn't a pattern. This is cruelty." Emily's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her husband shifted uncomfortably beside her, suddenly very interested in his water glass. The cousins avoided her gaze. Mom looked down at the papers, then at me. There were tears in her eyes, but also something else, shame. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on mine. "I should have listened to you," she whispered. I didn't squeeze back. "Not yet." Emily shoved back her chair. "You're pathetic," she hissed at me, though her voice trembled. "Dragging everyone into this, like some kind of martyr. You'll regret embarrassing me like this." But it wasn't me who looked embarrassed. It was her, standing red-faced in front of the family who now saw the truth laid bare. She stormed out, heels clacking, leaving her half-eaten dessert and silence in her wake. The room exhaled slowly, as if a storm had passed. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Another cousin shook his head. Aunt Rosa reached over and closed the folder gently, as though sealing the matter. Mom dabbed her eyes with a napkin. I don't know what to say. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. You don't have to say anything. The words spoke for themselves, and for the first time, no one at that table could deny it. The evening ended quietly, not with laughter, but with an unspoken agreement that things had changed. Emily had left in disgrace, and the spotlight she had always demanded now burned her instead of me. I walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air, the city humming around me, and felt a strange calm settle in my chest. Revenge wasn't always about shouting the loudest. Sometimes it was about letting the truth do the work. And in that moment, the truth had never been louder. The days after the dinner were strangely quiet, like the air after a storm has ripped through town. At first, I kept waiting for the phone to ring, for Emily's voice to come crashing through with fury, for the accusations to start flying. But the silence held. Word spread quickly through the family. By the weekend, even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were calling, not to gossip but to say, "We didn't know. We're sorry." They admitted they'd believed Emily's stories about me being selfish, irresponsible, a burden. It was easier to accept her version than to ask for mine. Now, with proof in front of them, they saw me differently. Some apologized. Others just sat with the discomfort. Either way, the balance had shifted. Mom was the hardest part. She called me 3 days after the dinner, her voice shaky. "I can't stop thinking about it," she confessed. How much I let her get away with. How blind I was. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that I didn't blame her, but the truth was more complicated. I did blame her, at least partly. She had chosen to ignore the signs, to believe the easier child, the shinier story. So instead of lying, I said, "It hurt, Mom, for years. But now you know." There was a pause and then a soft, broken sob. "I'm so sorry." That apology, imperfect, late, but real, did something Emily's humiliation never could. It loosened the knot in my chest. Emily, on the other hand, didn't apologize. Not once. She avoided family events, skipped calls, and when she finally did resurface, it was with a carefully curated story. She twisted my words. She told anyone who would listen. She planned it all, made me look like the villain. But the damage was done. Screenshots didn't lie. Receipts didn't lie. People had seen the proof with their own eyes. No amount of spin could erase that image of her storming out, red-faced and trembling. Even her husband grew distant. At the next family barbecue, he came alone, mumbling something about needing space. Whispers followed, rumors of fights, money troubles, late nights out. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. Because revenge, I realized, wasn't about destroying her. It was about freeing myself. For the first time in years, I felt light. I stopped walking into rooms expecting to be judged. I stopped explaining myself, stopped apologizing for existing. When relatives asked me for advice, I gave it without second-guessing. When Mom leaned on me, I supported her, but with boundaries. No more being the quiet one, the shadow child. I also started saying no, a word Emily had always claimed as her own weapon. No, I wouldn't lend money again. No, I wouldn't cover for her. No, I wouldn't carry her secrets. Each no felt like another thread of the old web snapping loose. Months passed. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, a thought struck me. I hadn't thought about Emily in days. She no longer lived rent-free in my head. She was just a person, flawed, bitter, and distant, but no longer my responsibility. And that, I realized, was the real revenge. Not the folder at the dinner, not the shock in her eyes, not even the whispers that followed her. The real revenge was my peace. The final reckoning came almost a year later. Another family dinner, another long table. This time, Emily showed up, thinner, quieter, her once bright dress replaced with muted tones. She avoided my gaze for most of the evening, but when dessert arrived, she finally looked at me. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, but she didn't. She just lowered her eyes and stayed silent. And strangely, I didn't need the apology anymore, because I had already won. I had built my life back, piece by piece. on a foundation of truth. I had found strength where she tried to carve weakness. I had stood in the fire and walked out without burning. The revenge wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't the silence that followed her. It was that I was free, and she was still trapped in the cage she built for herself. When I left that night, I felt no weight, no bitterness, no anger. Just a quiet certainty. I had been underestimated. I had been mocked. I had been betrayed. And still I rose.